It features Lebbeus's most recent body of work, a series of architectural projects ranging over the last 8 years. And it has a body of work, one section devoted to Long Beach, the most recent work in the show, his response to Long Beach. On the occasion of this exhibition, the University Art Museum and SCI-Arc have come together to present this public lecture this evening. This joint venture is one in a series of initiatives undertaken by the University Art Museum to collaborate with other cultural and educational institutions in the region, guided by the conviction that it is this kind of collaboration that benefits the institutions in question as well as the communities they serve by developing dynamic programming, such as the lecture that we will hear tonight by Lebbeus. On the staff of SCI-Arc, I wish to thank Michael Rotundi. I also wish to thank Rosemary Raven. And I also wish to thank the school's lecture committee for making this public lecture possible this evening. Without their equally enthusiastic belief in Lebbeus's brilliance, none of us would be here this evening. Before Lebbeus begins his slide presentation this evening, let me just say a few words about how I came to know him. It all began last fall when I attended his birthday party at Frank Gehry's Rebecca's restaurant in Venice. Lebbeus, who lives in New York, was in town doing conceptual architectural design work for a major motion picture. And at that time, he showed me samples of his exquisitely rendered, highly imaginative drawings. And I just had to see more. And so I made an appointment to see him in New York, and I went to visit him, and we spent several days going through years of work, drawings and models, and at that time I began to formulate the exhibition, which is now on view in Long Beach. The process of putting together this exhibition has been extremely rewarding because Lebbeus shared with me what he will share with you tonight, and that is a belief that architecture is not only construction and habitation, but also philosophy, a way of exploring new ways of thinking and being. With this belief, Lebbeus demands a lot of himself and of his inhabitants, but I believe the rewards are worth it. Before joining me in welcoming Lebbeus this evening, Thom Mayne, a dear friend and colleague of Lebbeus, will say a few words. Thom?
Boy, you're... The connection's bad or the microphone's bad? Is that okay? Okay. Becker, writing on Freud, noted that what we call a well-adjusted person has the capacity to particularize the world, to confront action. The normal person bites off what he can chew and digest of life, and no more. In other words, men aren't built to be gods, to take on the whole world. They are built like other creatures, to take a piece of the ground in front of their noses. As soon as man lifts his nose from the ground and starts sniffing at the eternal problems like life or death, the meaning of a rose, a star cluster, he's in trouble. Most men spare themselves this trouble by keeping their minds on the smaller problems of our lives, just as society maps these problems out for them. These are what Kierkegaard calls the immediate men, the Philistines. They tranquilize themselves with the day-to-day. They lead so-called normal lives. In order to function normally, one has to achieve from the beginning a serious constriction of the world and of himself. We can say that the essence of this normality is the refusal of reality itself. It's the abnormality, the obsessiveness of the work, which you'll see tonight, which so interests me in Lebbeus Woods. His architecture stands in stark contrast to the recalcitrance of our present time, anesthetized as it is by the deadening history and the fearfulness of even the most timid explorations of this reality. Leb's work responds, counterattacks, if you will, with the will of the experimental. Experiment, in his own words, meaning action without goal, undertaken for itself, challenging us into action. It is the now. It's about itself, understood as personal experience through sensation and perception. The body of the work is interested, I believe, in the territory between idea and matter, a synthesis of the tectonic and the sensual transmitted to us through the construction of his drawings, moving us backward and forward. One is, of course, reminded of the ambiguity of Piranesi, the dark, ominous, coherent images of Hugh Ferris, the inventive and the heroic stance of the modern movement, although no longer connected to the social political aspirations. The conviction now is that the passion of the architecture is now located within the isolated existence of the work, surrounded by uncertainty. My suspicion is that he embraces this uncertainty. I've known his work since the early 80s, and I've been very moved by its single-mindedness, its power, the visions that many of you, I'm sure, have had the same experience. We need more curious, open-minded people actively participating in a quest for understanding and knowledge. It's my pleasure to introduce Lebbeus Woods.
Yeah, I mean, I like this idea of the normative versus whatever it is that I do. Example one. To give a talk like this is a kind of privilege that I enjoy very much, I must tell you. But it's also difficult, and probably difficult because there's so much to say and so little time to do that. I like to keep it fairly brief. I want to show my projects, obviously, because this is the core, this is what my life and work are really about. But also I want to begin by saying a few things that have to do with what leads to this work and why I'm making what I make. I think that aside from all the psychological implications of Thom's introduction, which I think are very much to the point, I've been very interested in exploring some kind of basis for architecture. And this has been for many years. Some kind of basis other than that which is normally given, which is a kind of historical basis. I mean, architecture is the most conservative activity on earth normally presented, because it involves vast sums of money and all sorts of social responsibilities, and therefore one seeks some kind of basis in the deep roots of society or of culture for making architecture. Now, I respect that, believe it or not. I do indeed respect the need for that. At the same time, my impulse personally has been to look for something more fundamental than those historical, traditional bases for architecture. So all of what I will show you tonight, and the many things that I won't show you that preceded the projects I want to show tonight, are about a search for some basis for architecture more fundamental than tradition, history, and all those things which support a kind of idea of stability in architecture. I think that what is most fundamental in my work is some attempt to look at the world. And when we look at the world, any of us, we have to admit that it doesn't exist a priori. The world doesn't exist. We have to really create our own idea of the world. We have to invent the world, in effect. On some basis, what is it? I think it's something very personal, and yet we want to reach out to each other. We want to find some kind of common ground for inventing our idea of the world. So I always begin, and have begun in my life, with the physical, that which I sense, which I see. I think my earliest projects, going back 15, 20 years even, had to do with an attempt to take what I had sensed, what I had seen directly, and transmute it into some kind of architecture. This led me to a kind of almost alchemical, or certainly philosophically speaking, a kind of very traditional idea of cyclicality in architecture and in life, where nature is revealed as a series of changes, transformations over time, where one can't grasp the totality of the world in a moment, but only over time. So we see this passing of the seasons, the day, the night, and all of these things as some kind of unifying structure to nature, and therefore to our own lives. And my earliest projects, things like the Four Cities and others, even to the Epicyclarian project, had to do with an attempt to express the cyclicality of nature and of human thought in some kind of consonance with nature, as a direct response to what I could see and sense. At the same time, becoming aware that there is a kind of hidden world, a kind of realm of the same reality that we sense that is concealed. It's something we can't experience directly. And we can only do it through the imagination or through some kind of projection of the mind. And I have been tremendously interested in the developments in physics in the 20th century in this regard. Because the whole experiment in the 20th century to create an idea of nature beyond this kind of mechanistic, Newtonian world that we create through the direct experience of our senses has been the essence of our idea of ourselves and of our idea of knowledge. So what is the relationship of that to architecture? How does that relate to the making of such primitive things as buildings and of spaces that we might inhabit? This has been incredibly interesting to me. For example, the idea of uncertainty, the idea of the relationship between the observer and the observed. In other words, the subject and the object. What classical knowledge has given us as reality, which is something out there independent of us. The world is somehow going on whether we live or die. And our experience of it, I think in the 20th century, this has become more cloudy. This has become more uncertain, more ambiguous. This interests me tremendously in how it can relate to architecture. Because I think architecture, because of its attempt to root our lives in something very fundamental, has very much become and remained an activity devoted to stability, certainty, predictability. And yet, at the same time, everything we know about the world has been revolutionized by a knowledge that what we know is conditioned by our way of knowing, our senses, our minds. So that our relationship to nature is no longer what it once was, shall we say, in the 19th, even 18th century, the idea that there is something out there for us to know. Now we participate much more directly with the world, with our cities, with the landscapes we inhabit, in a way that is much more ambiguous because our participation changes, alters, colors that world, and produces a fundamental cloudiness or ambiguity about it. Architecture, the most conservative of activities in our present society, must somehow begin to deal with this fundamental ambiguity, uncertainty between the observer and the observed, between what we know and what is known. I myself, I cannot claim to have reached the point where what I present is going to be the definitive answer to this question. In fact, as I look at my projects, I must confess this to you. They're just mere sketches. They're simply ideas that I have put out that I have not even yet begun to develop. I hope that some idea that's embedded in these projects might excite one of you, young architects who are going into this world of architecture and into your own minds and lives, enough to carry forward something that I've contributed. It's almost an embarrassment to me how little I've developed the very ideas that are most dear to me. But I have a kind of restless mind. I want to move on. I want to keep alive. Especially the older I get, I want to keep my body moving, my mind moving. So I'm moving constantly, leaving behind this trail of drawings and models. What's important tonight, I would like to present my projects to you, and I will. In fact, in 1988, I was here, and that's 4 years ago already. Seems impossible, but it's been 4 years. And I've done a lot of work since I last came here. I'll begin with the project that I presented at that time, which was my project for Underground Berlin. But also I will add tonight an epilogue to these projects, which has come out of the last 4 months of my life, and which you will understand better once I get into the work itself. So if we can sort of take down the lights, I'll begin to talk about the project. The project I presented in '88 was a project called Underground Berlin. In fact, it was the only thing I talked about when I came here. And I think it was a project that, for me, was a breakaway project. I had reached a certain limit in my earlier works. This project really began to move into a different direction towards the indeterminacy and perhaps the exploration of that realm of the uncertain that I spoke of a moment ago. I'll just go quickly through this because it's already now 4 years old. But, oh my God, I just realized everything's going to be backwards. I think I loaded the slide projector wrong. Please indulge me on this. Too late to change. I don't really letter backwards. It's not an imitation of Leonardo, okay? So in '88, a woman in Berlin called Christine Feyerice, who is really one of the most interesting and dynamic personalities in Europe as a promoter of architectural investigations, organized an exhibition called Berlin, as I recall, I don't recall the name, but was asking for projects about Berlin in the future. And I was particularly fascinated with the idea that the underground lines from east to west went under the wall, and yet there was a kind of spatial connection between east and west. Keep in mind that the wall was still in evidence. So this plan shows, I have a pointer here, which I will try to use, even though everything is going to be backwards. The Tiergarten in West Berlin. This was the line where the wall went at that time. Of course, now it's been disassembled, but at that time we were still dealing with it. And I understood that the underground lines went from west to east. The U-Bahn, it's a subway, and along these lines. And I said, look, if the people of Berlin are ever going to unify this city, they're going to do it on their own. You can't leave it to the governments. They're going to bridge the gap somehow. And my proposition was that they would do it underground. They would go underground using these existing spaces that flow from east to west. This again being west, this is east already. In fact, this was Checkpoint Charlie right here. So if they're going to take these underground lines, which are here, one might imagine that with great German ingenuity, they might be able to construct some spaces, which I called civic spaces, under these existing lines. And they would begin to construct a series of buildings, if you will, that would be built from the surface datum down. There would be a kind of inverted architecture, towers, living spaces that would be built from the surface downward into this civic space beneath the U-Bahn lines. My proposition was further that these structures, these inverted towers, these things which hung from above to below, would be spaces for living and working. And of course my initial impulse was to create a kind of political unification. But what I began to think about once I had begun this process was that what is it like to live in the earth? What is it like to be underground and to exist in this new climate, some new climate of force? In other words, that architecture has always been something shaped by physical forces, wind, sun, air, earth. All of these things have always managed to shape architecture. If we go into the earth, if there's a new climate of forces, such as seismic forces, such as gravitational forces, such as electromagnetic forces generated by the Earth's core, what would this architecture be? So I began to evolve an architecture that would in some way respond to these forces. And the architecture I evolved was one that had to do with a kind of construction that would respond, almost in the way that musical instruments respond to that physical force of playing. So that the construction would be made of thin sheets of metal, suspended delicately, perhaps lightly at least, from core structures in which living and work would take place. And these structures would really respond in some way to the nature of this climate below the ground. And out of this experience of below the earth, would come some kind of new society, some kind of new community that had to do with the common experience of this seismic, of this physical experience. Always when I make a series of drawings, I'm very curious because the drawings to me are only a means of investigating architecture. So the next step is obviously to try to project it into 3 dimensions, and the models always follow. these photographs of models were based on, obviously, the drawings, but attempt to define this architecture of thin planes and, of course, structures. This architecture of a culture of the underground. I want to say one word about this because it seems to me that maybe this is just my own personal attitude towards life, but that living and working are not something you can separate out. You can't say, well, I work here and live there. Working and living are integral, they're a part of one another. So that these spaces were always intended to me to be spaces where whatever that activity of work was, so also would be the activity of living. Living in the sense of family, also in the sense of community, intimately related to a kind of interaction with the earth and with others in this civic space of the underground city. Now, at some point, the hypothesis was that those who lived underground, who went underground to unify Berlin, would want to return to the surface. How would they do this? Timidly, simply to climb back up through some kind of openings? No. I proposed a series of what I call projection towers. And these towers were an extension of that underground civic space breaking through the surface of the existing city. And here at the Alexanderplatz, which was then in so-called East Berlin, now it's simply in Berlin, the surface datum was again broken by a structure that would project through the surface of the city into that open space. Here's the old city hall. Sorry these are backwards. I hope it doesn't trouble you. It doesn't bother me that much, actually. Nice to see them in a different attitude. So that the idea of the projection tower was that the underground civic space and the life and the energy and even the physical energies that are derived from the planetary mass of the Earth would be carried up through a central shaft. That on this shaft would be constructed elements, parts, pieces, bits that were a further projection into the overground space of that underground culture. This is really a staging tower, a central shaft with elements, parts that are constructed for yet some unknown purpose. Often when I work, and I have no trouble admitting this, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm willing to proceed based on some kind of intuition about the ideas that interest me. And in this case, I was constructing this tower, these elements, without a clear idea immediately as to what purpose they would serve, what function they would have, or what kind of justification could be given. This drawing I made shows the projection tower coming up in the Alexanderplatz, and here we see the old cathedral and so on, with these elements sort of flying off from it that have been presumably built on the tower, on this shaft, the staging element. And that was the conclusion of the project. Somehow this underground culture would be projected. A year later, and by the way, this is all connected with European, I hate to admit it, but European tourism. It was decided that Paris would be the cultural city of Europe because in 1989 it was the bicentennial of the French Revolution. A new project was organized for Paris. And the proposition was, what will Paris be like in the 21st century? Well, I have no idea. I don't really even care. But I couldn't help but remember those pieces flying off of my projection tower in Berlin. So I said, all right, let's carry this further. What if these pieces begin to collect over Paris? So that you have bits and parts that were flying off, collecting over the city of Paris. What would that mean? What would that be? I don't know. Let's find out. So I being a kind of, I don't know, a kind of loner, I suppose, in a way. Naturally, I thought about these bits and parts being collected into individual structures, things that are somehow above the city, and that below there's a kind of landscape. I wasn't sure what this was. I knew that there were wires. I knew that there were connections to the earth below, but I didn't quite understand what they were. But I knew that each structure had to be somehow individual, different, a different configuration, a different assemblage of materials. They weren't mass-produced. And yet they had in common certain characteristics. They were in the air. They were in that wonderful Parisian sky, that wonderful light that does exist over Paris, and yet had that connection to the earth. And also this idea that they're sort of Frankenstein monsters, you know. They have this idea of being made of different body parts, that there would be a kind of heterogeneous quality to the geometry and to the nature of the elements. But of course, being, after all, an American and a kind of pragmatic guy, I said, what's holding these things up in the air? How can things be up in the air like that? I couldn't get very far away from that idea, so I devised a theory. And the theory has to do with the fact that the Earth has a magnetic field around it, and that if these flying structures, these elevated structures, can be thought of as kind of dipole magnets with the north and south pole surrounding them, that they might interact in some way with the magnetosphere of the Earth, which is a very powerful electric field, incredibly powerful. We don't know how much electricity is surrounding us even now, but it's in the form of free electrons. It hasn't been organized, so we don't feel its presence, but it's there. So I hypothesized that these are held aloft by geomagnetism in some way. I'll get back to this subject, don't worry. Also, I said, okay, underground Berlin is this kind of tunnel. I dignified it by calling it a civic space. It's a kind of community, a linear city. But what about free-floating things? Things that are moving in the fluid atmosphere of the Earth. What kind of community could that be? So I made a series of drawings, and I began to realize that it's really something very frightening. It's about a kind of community of parts that come together and go apart on a continuing basis, and that we don't know what kind of community that is. We don't know what kind of city that can make, a kind of aerial city, city of the future. This was don't forget, this is what they asked me to do. Something's going on. Okay, thank you. So I began to explore the architectural implications of this. Never mind all the sociological, philosophical implications. I began to make a series of drawings about the combinations of parts. This interested me as an architect. So I began to explore this idea of combinations of parts at different scales. Obviously, at the scale of a single structure, where one sees different elements brought together, all sorts of different elements, very thin, delicate elements, heavier elements, all brought together in some almost heterogeneous way, which recalled, in a sense, the idea of the community itself. In other words, if things are free-floating, if things are already fragmented, individual, what kind of community does that make? It appears certainly in the structure of the individual parts. So that if one thinks of a grouping of these free-floating structures in skies over Paris, one sees something that maybe comes together only for a few moments, kind of temporary assemblage, if you will, where one structure, one house, call it a house, meets another, meets another, meets another, meets another, in this aerial condition. Now here's some new element has been added, this planar, this bent plane, which I'll talk about in a second. And over the city of Paris, with all of its famous monuments, like the Eiffel Tower, which is built of cast iron, basically, if we're talking about geomagnetism, we're going to imagine some kind of distortion of this magnetic field that I've described that surrounds the Earth. And we see the nature, the physical nature of the community, a kind of vortex condition over the Eiffel Tower. If these things do respond to the electromagnetic forces, then they're certainly going to take a certain form at that point. And in fact, if you look at this idea of the plan of the city, which is almost an anachronism nowadays, how does one look at the plan of Los Angeles, for example? I don't know. I flew in, and I can't comprehend it. But this plan shows the old, here's Ile Saint Louis and all of that, and the center of Paris. But over this are drawn these nets, these forms, these loose sheets, and pulling these nets of these tiny, strong, towing structures, these aerial habitations that fly over Paris. Forgive me, but I mean, I'm interested in what we see and what we feel and what we sensually experience. So I must make drawings like this. I must make drawings which show the physical experience of space and of materials. So that here we see the structures at different distances, and we also see these sheets that they're pulling, these almost grids, this new grid over the city, a kind of grid that is constantly fluctuating over that fixed plan of the old Paris. And in fact, I said I'd get back to it, the nature of this sheet in that magnetic field and also in the air provides an electrical charge which feeds back into these structures, which allows them to interact with that invisible magnetic field of the Earth. And of course there's an architecture there. I mean, I don't know, Fry Otto has done some very interesting things with, forgive me, but I remember the 1972 Olympics and Otto's beautiful structures. There's an architecture in that fluctuating, tensile structure of sheets, of fabric, of material pulled in the wind, or even in the magnetic fields of the Earth. So many drawings were devoted to that idea of an architecture of temporality. A kind of concluding image that I wanted to show you is simply of bringing those elements together, the different geometries, the different elements of an aerial architecture that I was trying to develop in the skies over Paris. Of course, I wanted to make a model, and I knew that it would be difficult because I had promised a floating structure. The best I could do was a structure that was floated in a exhibition space in Paris in '89, which is almost more an investigation of materials and of form than it was of that actual floating thing. But I'm interested in very heavy things that float. Light things that float don't surprise me. A feather blowing in the wind is nothing surprising, but a heavy steel thing is. So this construction was made, not floated, I must confess, by electromagnetism, but by cables in the usual charlatan fashion. But also it allowed me to investigate that thing that fascinates me about architecture, are those differences between the very heavy, the very light, the tense, the slack, all of those contrasts that we can build in with our understanding of materials and their differences. Because we are materialists. We are in love with materials. It's like a very pathological thing. And yet, there it is. Architects love materials. And they love the fact that materials decay, that materials don't remain the same under different conditions. I had an opportunity just this last year, in, 1990, to reinvestigate the Berlin situation. There was a competition organized in Frankfurt at the Architecture Museum to look at the new Berlin, the Berlin without the wall. I wasn't invited to participate, I must tell you this. But I decided to participate anyway because I love the city. And so I did. So in a way, I couldn't help but carry on this kind of narrative structure of the city of Paris, these aerial elements. So John Haydock, who's a good friend of mine and was invited, by the way, said, look, Lebbeus, take my material. I'm not going to do what they asked me anyway. Just take these aerial photographs and all this stuff and use them. So I began to take these aerial images. And what happened, but these sort of elements began to appear, somewhat more abstract in the Parisian, the aerial Paris project, over the city of Berlin, sort of returning to the place of their birth. If you think back to the projection tower. In fact, I began to think about what these elements were, and they've been somewhat transformed. Maybe they're a little more beaten up, and they've been through a little bit more wear and tear. But also, as you may have observed so far, I have a tremendous interest in this idea of structure through shape. In other words, that the shape of a thing gives it structural strength. So that, in this case, these bent shapes, even these crumpled and wrinkled and semi-destroyed shapes, actually are a way of providing a structural strength and integrity to a form. So I began to draw these elements arriving back in Paris, from Paris to Berlin. And yet they don't appear now in a kind of beautiful sunny sky, but in some kind of abstract landscape, some kind of grid, some kind of alien, almost, landscape to them. But light is always important, the presence of light and sensuality of form. And here in this sort of montage image, we see these abstract elements, but now we begin to see again this three-dimensional form diving towards some intersection of the street in Berlin. Once they dive, these elements, where do they land? How do they land? Well, it's perhaps all just imaginary, but certainly they go into the existing structures, and maybe are even deformed by the existing structures. So if we imagine one of these elements and an existing building in the center of Berlin, it's not too great a leap of imagination to imagine the combination of the two. This structure and the new structure somehow inhabiting that old Cartesian, Euclidean world of architecture as we know it. And what are these structures? In other words, what do they have to do with human life? What do they have to do with inhabitation, usefulness, purpose? I don't know. But one thing is, one can be in them. In other words, if you make a space big enough, you can get in it. Now, is that architecture? Well, I don't know. Is it? But if you can be in it, you can live in it. You can do something in it. And one thing that seemed especially intriguing to me was that if this is a section or a fragment of a section through an existing building, we see some floors here, some windows, a little chair, and we see this intervention of this structure. And within that structure is a space, and within that space is an assemblage of objects. What are these objects? Well, I imagine that this was the white box. We've all heard of the black box. This is the white box. This held all the magic of our technology to communicate at vast distances, to talk to the end of the universe if we wanted to project ourselves through technology, through telecommunications, to distant places, to see things very small, to see things very large. And if we could inhabit this strange space and yet find certain places of rest where we might make that connection with the outside world, and this was a kind of structure that might be placed in the center of Berlin, the city that's going to be soon filled with skyscrapers and corporate headquarters, we might find some kind of structure that would suggest a different kind of life. Seems stuck. Anybody up there? Thank you. What does his life have to do with? Well, I can't say. I don't know. I'm not a designer of life. I don't want to be. I don't want to get into telling people how to live. All I can do is create certain drawings or certain forms that allude to life. So here what I did was make a little drawing of some person sitting next to one of these white boxes and projecting off of that a kind of world of words, images, evoking perhaps sounds, but something more, shall we say, not immediately intelligible, not something we can decipher immediately. We don't know what it means, because we really don't know what it means. Have you ever listened to the radio in some distant place? The sounds come in from 3 or 4 stations at once, and you have this incredible kind of montage of crackling voices. This is our modern world. This is the world of even of TV that is in our households. We flip from one channel to the next. So-called information. I would prefer just simply to call it experience, is merged indiscriminately without any meaning, without any predetermined pattern. This is what would happen in these structures. There would be a network of communication established, something I call a heterarchy, having to do with the other, having to do with dialogue. Why are we having this problem? Thank you. So, led me to do a series of backwards graphic experiments. Maybe this is better. I should always do this, show it backwards. And I'm leaving out my own jargon like free space, free zone, and all that. Forget that. What's important is the feeling of the idea and what it might imply. But I think that we are visual people, architects, and we can never rely too much on words. We have to go always back to that visual thing to understand our own ideas. If we ultimately end up relying on an explanation that we can only give in words, then it's something lost to us. So my visual experiments have to do with the attempt to communicate at that level. The city then becomes the old city, the city of Berlin, that familiar sort of gridiron at the center of the city, again backwards. But if the Potsdamer Platz, Leipziger Platz, Brandenburg Gate, center of the city, But within that now begins to happen a different network, a different structure which is overlaid and insinuated into that existing city. These black marks are those free space structures, and these other colored white, yellow, blue lines are the interconnections which are ephemeral, always changing. They form a new pattern. A series of section drawings, always exploring that physical nature of these structures. The existing structure, the new structure within this white box, kind of resting place within an interior landscape, which is always evolving, changing. Why doesn't this work? Can someone tell me this? An interior view of such a space. This is one idea I think is very important. I just want to allude to it. And that is that the structure of these interior spaces is something which is difficult to inhabit. I'm terribly interested in spaces which are difficult to inhabit. I mean, the Cartesian Euclidean world, which we're well familiar with, we know how to inhabit that. But what happens if we confront space which we don't know how to walk in, we don't know how to stand in, we don't know how to move in? What does that mean to us physically? What does that mean to our idea of life? These spaces have surfaces which are not convenient, if you will. They're not accessible. Here's one of the white boxes. How do you get to it? I don't know. You climb. I can't resist making section drawings. This is actually the former Communist Party headquarters in East Berlin. This is one of the free space structures built into that plan section perspective. I'm a centralist. I mean, I believe in what I feel and see in a direct way. And the reason I make the drawings I make, these types of drawings, because I want that experience. I desperately want to feel, taste, and touch physical things. And this, since I don't have clients who are willing to build this work, and I don't, then I have to draw it. So I do. By the way, this is what I would think of as an exterior drawing of one of these insinuated free space structures within one of the existing buildings. It's actually the exterior, but it's still interior. There's almost no exterior presence to these structures. I have a couple more projects, and I don't want to dwell on them too long, but I've always, as you can see from the former projects, been interested in the relationship of the city to the building. In other words, there's an idea of an overall city structure, and then there's an idea of a building that evolves from that. Sometimes I simply want to deal with a single structure to see if I'm not relying too heavily on this kind of big idea, this big form, this overall pattern, in order to make architecture. So 2 years ago I made this project, no client of course. I made this project called the Solo House for one person living alone. A section drawing and plan drawing shows that single space of the solo house, quite a large house of course, but the platforms that intervene into that space, which don't interrupt it really, are the places where one might dwell. The plan also gets back to this idea of the structural integrity of this house derives from its shape. In other words, this is a structurally integral form. It has great resistance to stresses from all sides, simply because of its shape. Its construction is very thin and light, a kind of stress skin construction. Using perspective drawings, and I want to use perspective drawings because I'm interested in a landscape. I spoke earlier of nature, the relationship of architecture to that, of our human experience to that. To me, perspective drawing is a way of envisioning a world landscape. Even if we only see a piece of a sky, a piece of a horizon, a piece of the earth, the rest is implied from that. So I use the perspective drawings as a way of investigating that landscape and the architecture within it. So I really am, I suppose, a kind of totalitarian. I want to know the world in its totality, not simply in its fragments. And by the way, each perspective drawing, is built up through a series. These are not presentation drawings. I don't make these to show to somebody, to show in lectures or to some client. I make them as an investigation, so that I investigate things like the nature of the materials, what might happen, what might be, the proportions of one part to another part. And from one drawing to the next, they're always different. This is very funny because I made this drawing. I hated this drawing. I only show it to you because I like all of us, sometimes when I pursue a design idea, I paint myself into a corner. I painted myself into a corner with this. In fact, I even do this ridiculous thing, which I nicknamed the house pet. I didn't know what else to call it. I had no idea what it was. But obviously, I left myself a place to sit as my drawing tablet and my pencils, and I was hoping for a better idea. The way I found that better idea was actually through the model, and it's on display at the University Art Museum at Long Beach. This model was constructed, I guess, 2 years ago now, and it really was an investigation of this idea of the solo house, of its parts, of its totality, through its material nature. And the material transformed from this kind of copper-like metal to steel. Also, there are certain elements within it that are important. Not only the single unified solo space, but certain elements that are attached to it, which I'll try to explain in a moment. Yep, go back. One thing that is part of my work is this idea of instrumentation. I spoke originally of underground Berlin and the structures themselves being kind of instruments, something that measures physical presence of forces ambient in the earth or around the earth. Light, I mean, certainly architecture measures light, which is in this room, it's in space, black as it may seem, but only takes a form when it's reflected from a surface. And architecture, because of its mathematical nature, makes a very precise measurement of light. It gives light a structure. But also potentially as an instrument projecting human senses of all kinds into the world outside of the human body. So I've invented various kinds of instruments. In this case, there's an instrument here. And as we'll see in a moment, there's an instrument within the house. What these instruments are is a subject of speculation. The house itself is not entered, even though it's very axial and symmetrical, about a certain bilateral line. It's not entered on that axis, but through a kind of ledge that leads through a door and into this interior space. This view, which shows a kind of illumination from within, suggests a bit more about that nature of that space. One sees, obviously, the entry point, a means of climbing, and one of these inhabitable platforms suspended within the space. And on that platform is one of these instruments. What are these instruments? What are we measuring? Why is science, why is the kind of architecture I'm talking about interested in measuring experience? What is it we're looking for? Why do we need to quantitatively define our experience of the world? Why can't we just sense it and be satisfied? In this case, there's a chair, there's a series of elements. What purpose do they serve? I like the idea of inventing instruments that I don't know what purpose they serve. In the way that, let's face it, we don't know what any of these things we make ultimately means. They only serve a kind of purpose that we invent for them. The purpose of this instrument perhaps is to measure light, perhaps is as a kind of electronic means of communicating with other places in the world, other solo houses, if you will, other isolated stations where other people are sitting in some kind of strange little chair suspended over a platform in a space, or for some purpose that they might imagine or invent for that mechanism. You know, I think that the essential condition of human life is one of isolation. And maybe this photograph, and I make my own photographs of the models, evokes in me more of a feeling of isolation, that thing of the night when we're alone, when we are inside the things we create, wondering about what else is out there through instrumentation, through architecture, through even our imagination. Go quickly, there's two more projects. And fairly quickly through them. One of the most interesting, we've lost this again. One of the most interesting experiences I've had in my life, really, and certainly in recent years, has been to go to Zagreb in Croatia, Yugoslavia. I was invited to give an exhibition there, and I didn't, you know, the thing about giving exhibitions is you just simply pack up all your goods, things you've made over the years, and sort of take them to some distant capital and roll them out and say, well, here's what I've done. What do you think? Or do you want to participate in some way? And I couldn't help but feel that going to Zagreb at this moment in its history, when it's going through this incredible transformation from this socialist totalitarian system, trying to struggle out of that into some new condition that it doesn't even know, and that no one really, certainly not we Americans, can predict for it. I wanted to go there with a project. So I made a series of drawings and I made a series of proposals. This drawing is simply an image. It simply says Zagreb is part of this electromagnetic pool of forces that surrounds the Earth. It's part of a global interconnection. And beneath these concentric or distorted concentric lines is the plan of the city. An interesting city. I won't go into detail, but an incredible city. And that what is it about these lines? These lines are really invisible. I wanted to make visible what is invisible. If we could manifest in this room right now all the electromagnetic waves that are flowing through it from radio, television, things we can't see or hear without instruments, but which are here nonetheless, if we could manifest them, what would they look like? That interests me. I don't know this certainly doesn't look like that, but this is an attempt to state at least my interest. So I proposed for Zagreb a series of structures that would be, unlike Berlin, buried in buildings, would be in the streets. And that these structures would, in fact, rely on the existing structures in some way. In this case, we see that they sit on a single point, this being the single structural point of rest. And that at certain points, certain strong points of lateral strength in the existing buildings, some of these structures lean. They lean. They're leaning, kind of placed and leaning in the streets. They're habitations. And the space that is habitable, obviously, is above this single, very tiny point, which has a nice practical advantage of letting traffic flow around it. But there is some habitable space in there. And they lean against these old existing structures. This is a party wall, a lot of lateral strength in that wall. It can take the bearing stress of the weight of the structure. What kind of spaces are inside? Well, it's like Berlin. There are these kind of difficult to inhabit spaces. And within those spaces are these nodes of electronic instrumentation. How do you get in? I never addressed that in this drawing. How do you enter this space? There it is. But I knew that once you were in the space, the human scale guy, right? Well, there's some kind of instrumentation. This person seems to be holding some kind of sheet of something, and perhaps it's a mirror, perhaps it's a viewing screen, perhaps it's something looking out, perhaps it's something that reflects the image of the viewer back to themselves. And that has to do with this idea of knowledge that is part of our new understanding of ourselves, the breakdown between observer and observed that I alluded to in the beginning. The other thing about these structures, and something that interests me very much, is their mobility. I mean, they're not self-propelled, but they can be lifted, taken from place to place. And in this case, this is one of these wonderful U.S. helicopters that was in the Persian Gulf lifting tanks around the desert. Why can't it lift one of these structures above Zagreb? This is the wonderful cathedral in Zagreb, great mountains that form the background of that city. That dual prop transport helicopter can move one of these structures from one place to another. The modern tower there in the city, in the older fabric of urban structures. The other thing is that not just leaning, but it's possible to take that other approach, not compression, but tension. So that the same very strong points, these same party walls or floor lines can be used to create tension cables which suspend structures in the street for a day, a month, a year, a lifetime. I don't know. It depends on how long it's necessary for them to be there. That's something that's to be determined by those who bring them there, who inhabit them, who take them away. I had the opportunity, and this is a very rare thing, to actually propose building something. All of these projects, all of these years, no one's ever said, hey, why don't you try to build one of these things? But actually in Zagreb, they said, hey, why don't you try building one of these things? I said, glad you asked. So in the courtyard of the museum, where I had the very same exhibition, which is defined here as a section through this courtyard, there's a plan drawing of this courtyard. I proposed one of these free space structures, resting on its point, standing with an inhabitable space above. I was able finally to answer the question, how do you get into it, which is by a kind of folding ship's ladder that bends down from that central shaft, that closes after you enter, and that you enter this space with this instrumentation. They want to build it. The nature of that space interests me very much. I mean, many of my drawings are exterior drawings of forms, but I'm extremely interested in that inner space, that inner sanctum. And it's a space that certainly is ambiguous, maybe not so easy to inhabit by all the conventions we know, but might challenge us to find new ways to be there. Sending signals to Mars here. I don't know what's happening. This is the model constructed for that project in the courtyard of the museum in Zagreb. It's a study model, but it does take the structural idea of this leaning structure, the structure that's leaning forward, it's held back to those existing strong points in the building, and uses its leaning or wanting to fall as a structural principle. Obviously, it's something I said many times earlier, I think, that I'm very interested in the visual and what is modulated in terms of light, in terms of that visual presence. So I want to create something as three-dimensional as possible, something that has a three-dimensional presence which is constantly changing as we experience it, as we move around it and through it. Hello? Well, play of light is important.
Well endowed. There.
Yeah, thank you. The elements that move on the structure are such as these pieces are modulators of light that affect the play of light in that space. Only one problem at the present time is that there's a terrible civil war going on in Zagreb. And architecture seems to be on the back burner, as it were. I wish it weren't so for many reasons, mainly because I don't want to see those people undergo that horror. The last thing I want to show is a project only in model form, and some of my colleagues here have also participated in this project with their own proposals. Is a series of photographs of the model I made for the Museum for Applied Arts in Vienna, which has to do with this idea of terra nova, which I never got around to mentioning. The idea of making a new earth, of reforming the earth, which is the ultimate human arrogance. We're going to reshape the earth. But in this case, this project, which is a structure which flows over a kind of very powerful Euclidean structure built in the courtyard of the museum, in a way is redundant and a redoubling of a human intervention over the original earth, which is long buried beneath all of the construction that has happened there. I think also it has to do with the idea of reformation and of reestablishing a new ground plane that has to do itself with all of those things I've tried to allude to, such as geometry, such as light, such as arrogance, and a kind of desire to invent nature or reinvent it in a new form. I should point out, this is going to be a very obscure reference, but someday I hope you go to Vienna. I hope you go to the Museum for Angewandte Kunst, and you see this amazing platform built by its director. If you do, you'll see also the end wall of the Academy of Applied Arts, under which this form, which I designed, was constructed in this model, and over which this new terrain flows. And in fact, one thing that interested me about this was the chance to redouble the idea of the edge. The director had created with this magnificent cantilever an edge already very dramatic, very challenging to the existing Viennese fabric. And I simply wanted to challenge the challenge, to redouble the edge, to provide a new edge in the form of this tiny platform placed over the drop that proceeds from this platform to the canal below. So here we see the platform and my proposal. I want to conclude. If we have the lights, please, with just a couple of remarks. I usually like to end on something very visual and very strong, but I must say that I think that architecture needs much more, and I say this about my own work too, to engage really essential issues that affect our society today. I mean, our society is this incredible exploding thing. I mean, politically what's happening in the world is immense. I think I haven't made it much to do about that in this reference to my projects, but I think I myself have an instinct to imagine the ethical nature of architecture, the idea of community, the idea of the use of space. All of these things challenge our understanding of what architecture might be, but they're coming to us now from the other side, not from architecture, from within architecture, but from without architecture in our society. And I simply hope that here at SCI-Arc and other schools, which are the real breeding grounds, which are the real places for something to begin to happen in architecture that's not just aesthetic, not just style, not just form making for some sort of gratuitous audience, can really begin to happen. I haven't done justice to that in my remarks, but I have to conclude with that. And I hope some of you will understand. Thank you.
I'm sorry, but Lebbeus is not going to be able to stay and answer any questions. He has a plane to catch.